I didn't expect it at all. I mean, how could I? Sitting there at the dinner table, enjoying the quiet after a long day, my 42-year-old wife, Sarah, looks me dead in the eye and tells me she's going out to dinner with a colleague. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Dinner with a colleague sounds innocent enough, right? But let's not sugarcoat it. This wasn't just a friendly dinner. It was a date. A full-on, no-holds-barred date with some guy she works with. And she just threw it out there like it was nothing. Now let me backtrack a bit. Sarah and I got married when she was 22. Young, naive, and pregnant. We barely had a clue what we were doing, but we went through with it anyway, like so many young couples do. It's funny, looking back now, people in their 20s these days seem so much more put together than we ever were. But at the time, it felt like the right move. And it wasn't all bad. There were good years, especially at the start. After we tied the knot, I started investing. I'd always had a knack for numbers, and I built a business around it, turning my company into something successful. We became well off, more than comfortable, really. I gave Sarah and our family a life a lot of people would envy. But no amount of money could fix what came next. We had a son, our pride and joy. But he was born sick, real sick. And let me tell you, there's nothing worse than watching your child suffer and knowing that, despite all the money, all the doctors, all the treatments, you can't save him. That kind of helplessness stays with you, haunts you. Our son passed away after years of battling his illness. And Sarah, well, Sarah changed. She withdrew. I get it, grief does that to people. But she didn't just shut down, she shut me out. Completely. We were still married on paper, but emotionally, physically, we might as well have been strangers sharing the same space. I tried everything I could think of. Therapy, vacations, time off work, anything to get her back. But nothing worked. For years, she was like a ghost living in our house, unreachable. It took psychologists a long time to get her to open up even a little. Things improved after a while, but not by much. She wasn't the same, and I wasn't sure she'd ever be again. So, fast forward to that night at the dinner table. She drops the bombshell. She's going out with this guy, her colleague. She had the nerve to act like it was no big deal. He's just a friend, she said. He's been so supportive, and I just need someone to talk to. Yeah, right. I'm not stupid. This wasn't just about talking. Her morale was better, she said. Her energy was up, thanks to him. At that moment, I didn't know what to say. My brain just froze. I mean, how do you respond when your wife casually tells you she's going on a date with another man? I didn't want to explode. I didn't want to argue, so I just stood up and walked out of the kitchen. I didn't even grab my keys, my phone, nothing. I just walked, and she ran after me. I'll never forget the sound of her voice, full of desperation, like she knew she had pushed things too far. Wait, she called, her footsteps quick behind me. It's not like that. Please, just listen. But I didn't want to listen. I mean, what was she going to say that could possibly justify this? That it wasn't a betrayal? That this was somehow normal? She begged me to believe her. She said it wasn't cheating. She told me that he was just a colleague and that I was making this out to be worse than it really was. But then she threw in the kicker. He's helped me feel alive again, she said. You don't understand how much I've needed this. Needed what, exactly? A dinner? A man who's not me? I was too angry to respond. But one thing was crystal clear. If I told her not to go, she'd still go. I know her. Sarah's the type of woman who always gets what she wants, no matter the cost. The problem is she never seems to think about how high the price might be. I needed to figure out what to do next. I wasn't going to just let this slide. No way. I put up with a lot from her over the years, but this was crossing a line I couldn't ignore. I needed proof. Cold, hard proof of what she was up to. So I called a buddy of mine who knows people. The kind of people who can dig into someone's life and find out everything there is to know. I told him the situation, and he hooked me up with a private investigator. I wanted it all. Who this guy was, how he lived, what his intentions were. I wanted to know where they went, what they talked about, what they did. And yeah, I wanted pictures. I wanted to see them together, up close and personal. Because here's the thing, deep down, I knew this was more than just dinner. I could feel it in my gut. Something was off, and I wasn't about to sit back and watch my life fall apart without knowing exactly what was happening behind my back. So, that's where I left things. The PI was on the job, and I was waiting to find out who this guy was, what my wife was really up to, and how the hell I was supposed to deal with it. And yeah, I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I just confront her head on? Right then and there. Well, I've learned over the years that sometimes you've got to be patient. Let the truth come to you. And when it does, you hit back hard. But for now, I waited. And that, my friends, is where it all started. The detective didn't waste any time. A few days after I gave him the green light, he came back with the first bit of intel on this guy, Bob. Yeah, his name was Bob. It's always some guy with a boring, regular name, isn't it? But don't let that fool you. Bob wasn't just some nobody. He had a family, 2 kids, a wife, a decent job. The guy lived in a nice house, one of those suburban McMansions with a white picket fence and probably a dog in the yard. The whole picture-perfect life. But you know what they say about appearances, right? Underneath that surface, people like Bob, they're all hiding something. And I was going to find out exactly what that was. The detective didn't just give me the basics either. He went deep. I got everything. Bob's home address, where his kids went to school, what his wife did for work, even what kind of car he drove. All of it laid out for me, like a dossier on the guy who apparently was so supportive of my wife that she felt the need to dress up and go out with him. I stared at his photo for a long time. The dude looked harmless enough, like some average middle-aged guy who'd rather be watching sports than sneaking around with another man's wife. But looks can be deceiving, and I wasn't taking any chances. I'm not stupid. I knew Sarah wasn't telling me the full story, and I wasn't about to sit around waiting for her to come clean. So I started planning. You see, when you've got the kind of money I do, you can make things happen. Big things. And I didn't care how much it cost. This was about my pride, about finding out the truth and getting my revenge. My next move? Well, it required a certain type of person, and I knew just who to talk to about that. I reached out to an old friend. This guy, let's call him Mike, had connections in all the right places, if you know what I mean. He owed me a few favors from way back, and when I told him what was going on, he didn't hesitate. He got in touch with someone almost immediately. This girl, well, let's just say she was exactly what I needed. She was young, 27, maybe 28 at most. Blonde, with legs for days and a face that would make any man do a double take. The kind of woman who could make someone like Bob forget all about his nice little family in the suburbs. When Mike showed me her picture, I didn't even have to think about it. I gave the go-ahead right away. She was perfect. And yeah, I know what you're thinking. You probably have a pretty good idea what this girl does for a living, but I'm not going to spell it out here. I know how Reddit works, and I'm not about to get this post flagged for inappropriate content. Let's just say she was very professional and leave it at that. With her on board, the plan was really coming together. But I wasn't going to stop at just setting Bob up. No, I wanted to cover all my bases. That's why I also put a guy on him, Mateo. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. I wanted to know what Bob was doing when he wasn't with her, how he spent his time, who else he might be seeing. I needed a full picture, not just some half-assed snapshot of a single date. The private investigator was still digging up dirt, and I had the girl ready to make her move. I was confident that everything would play out just how I wanted. Bob would slip up, guys like him always do, and when he did, I'd be right there to catch him in the act, with all the evidence I needed. But then, out of nowhere, the whole thing nearly blew up in my face. It was the day before the supposed date with Bob when Sarah dropped a bomb on me. We were sitting in the kitchen, and I was playing it cool, acting like I wasn't planning her whole downfall behind the scenes. She looked up from her phone and casually said, "I've been thinking. I'm not going to meet Bob tomorrow after all." For a second, I couldn't even process what she was saying. She wasn't going? After all the effort I'd put into this? After I had everything set up to catch her and Bob red-handed? What the hell was going on? I forced myself to stay calm. "Oh," I asked, pretending to be nonchalant about it. "Why not?" She hesitated for a moment, then said, "I just changed my mind. I don't think it's appropriate. Instead, I'm going to meet up with a friend. We're going to grab dinner at that new restaurant downtown." I stared at her, my mind racing. Something about this didn't sit right with me. Sure, maybe she had changed her mind about Bob. Maybe she realized how fucked up it would be to actually go through with it. But something about the way she said it felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on here than she was letting on. And when Sarah said she was meeting a friend, I had to wonder if this friend was someone else entirely. Was it still Bob? Or was there another guy in the picture? I knew better than to push her on it, though. If I showed too much interest, she'd get suspicious. So I nodded and let her think I was okay with it. But deep down, I wasn't about to let her off the hook that easily. No, the plan was still on. I wasn't going to call off the private investigator or the girl just because Sarah had a sudden change of heart. Whatever she was doing, whether it was with Bob or not, I was going to find out. She could change the narrative all she wanted, but at this point, I had too much riding on the outcome. So, I sat back, pretending everything was fine, while behind the scenes, I set the wheels in motion. And believe me, I was going to catch her. One way or another, Sarah was going to slip up. And when she did, I'd be ready. My gut had been right all along. Sarah was still planning to go on that date with Bob. It didn't matter what she had told me in the kitchen. Her actions spoke louder than her words. The detective confirmed it for me when he sent over the latest update. She had booked a table for two at a nice restaurant, the kind of place we used to go to when things were good between us. But that wasn't the worst part. She also rented a hotel room. And not just any room, a room that cost $400 a night. The kind of room you don't just rent to talk. I knew what was going on. It didn't take a genius to figure it out. Dinner, drinks, and then a night in that expensive hotel with Bob. I could feel my blood boiling just thinking about it. But I had to stay focused. This wasn't the time to lose my cool. I had to act, and I had to act smart. First things first, I assigned one of the two detectives to watch Bob's house. I needed to know if Bob's wife was going to be home while my wife was out screwing around with him. It was part of the plan, and everything had to be timed perfectly. The goal wasn't just to catch Sarah and Bob in the act. I needed to blow up his life too. So, we waited. That's the worst part of this kind of thing. The waiting. Knowing what's happening, knowing what's about to go down, but having to sit on your hands and wait for the right moment to strike. Then the first piece of evidence came in. A photo. It showed Sarah sitting at the table with Bob, looking all cozy, like she didn't have a husband waiting for her at home. But that wasn't what set me off. No, what really made my blood boil was the second photo that followed. It showed them kissing, right there in the middle of the restaurant, like they didn't have a care in the world. Like everything they were doing was perfectly normal. I wanted to lose it. I wanted to punch a hole in the wall, smash something, anything, but I had to keep my head straight. This was just the beginning. I knew they wouldn't stop at the restaurant. The hotel room was waiting, and I had no doubt they were headed there next. But before they could get there, I had another move to make. I called the detective who was stationed outside Bob's house. "Is she home?" I asked, referring to Bob's wife. "Yeah, she's home," he confirmed. Perfect. That was all I needed. I sent the detective the photo of Bob and Sarah kissing, along with some very specific instructions. I'll never forget the rush of satisfaction I felt when I imagined how this was going to play out. The detective knocked on the door, and when Bob's wife answered, she was probably expecting something routine. But what she got was anything but. The detective didn't mince words. He asked her if she knew where her husband was. Of course, she didn't. Bob had told her he'd be working late, just like he probably always did when he snuck around behind her back. So when the detective asked her again, she got nervous. I could almost picture her panic, thinking something terrible had happened to him. But the detective reassured her. "No, he's fine," he said, "but I think you should take a look at this." He handed her the photo, the one of Bob kissing Sarah, and I can only imagine the look on her face. Her world probably started crumbling right there on the doorstep. She stammered something about how Bob was supposed to be at work, that he'd said he'd be home late. But the detective cut her off, calmly letting her know that her husband wasn't working late. He was on a date. I knew exactly what would happen next. As soon as the detective walked away, Bob's wife would be dialing his number, screaming into the phone, demanding answers. And when he saw her name pop up, I bet Bob's heart would skip a beat. He'd make up some excuse, try to calm her down, but she wouldn't be having any of it. No, she'd be in full panic mode. And just like I expected, Bob would rush home, desperate to salvage whatever he could of his mess of a life. While that shitstorm was brewing on Bob's end, I was sitting at home, waiting for Sarah to come back. I had her picture in my hand, the one of her kissing Bob, and I'll tell you what, that was the last time I'd ever feel anything for her again. That image was burned into my brain, and whatever love or respect I still had for her was long gone. But that wasn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. I had more on my sleeve. This wasn't just about catching her in the act or humiliating Bob. No, this was about completely dismantling everything. And while I sat there waiting for Sarah, I was already putting the finishing touches on the next part of my plan. You see, Sarah thought she was clever, thought she could pull this off without consequence. But she didn't realize who she was dealing with. I'd spent years building a business, making connections, learning how to take control of situations and turn them to my advantage. This was just another deal to me, another problem that needed to be solved. And when I was done, she and Bob were going to regret every decision that led them to that dinner table. The moment of revenge was finally within reach. I've been playing the long game, watching everything unfold, and now it was time to pull the trigger. Do you remember that blonde girl I mentioned? The one with the stunning looks, perfect blonde hair, legs that didn't seem to quit, and a body that could make any man forget his own name? Well, if you didn't pick up on it before, let me make it clearer now. She wasn't just some random girl I met. No, she was the tool I needed to set the final piece of my plan in motion. You might have guessed what her profession was, but I'll keep it vague here for obvious reasons. When Sarah left for her date, the blonde was already at my house waiting. She looked even better in person, dressed in this sleek, tight dress that left little to the imagination. We sat down, shared a few glasses of wine. To be honest, I needed the wine more than she did. I was on edge, not from nerves exactly, but from the anticipation. The knowledge of what I was about to do weighed on me. It's not every day you plan to cheat on your wife, even if it's for revenge. But then again, was this even cheating? Could it be called that when she had already blown up our marriage with Bob? It didn't feel like betrayal, not on my part. This was payback. After a couple more glasses, we headed upstairs. Now let me make one thing clear. There was nothing romantic about what happened next. This wasn't passion. This wasn't love. It wasn't even lust, to be honest. It was just a transaction, something that needed to be done to close the loop on what Sarah had started. The blonde girl was good at what she did, but my mind was elsewhere the whole time. I wasn't thinking about her. I wasn't even really thinking about Sarah at that moment. It was like going through the motions. We started having sex, but it felt more like checking off a box than anything else. There was no emotion, no satisfaction. I wasn't there for the pleasure. This was business. I remember lying there, going through the process, and all I could think about was how Sarah would react when she walked through that door. The shock on her face when she saw me in bed with another woman. That was what I was waiting for. That was the only part of this that mattered. And, sure enough, right on schedule, the front door opened. I heard it creak, followed by her footsteps echoing through the hallway. We didn't stop. I didn't pause, didn't hesitate. I wanted her to walk in on it. I wanted her to see it all. When Sarah finally stepped into the room and saw us, her scream was immediate. She screamed like she had just walked into the middle of a crime scene, and maybe she had. She froze in the doorway, her eyes wide, her face pale, completely stunned by what she was witnessing. It was like everything in her world was crumbling around her in real time, and she couldn't process it. The blonde didn't linger. She got dressed so quickly, you'd think she had been preparing for this exact scenario her whole life. She didn't say a word, didn't even look back as she slipped out of the room and out the front door, leaving Sarah and me alone to deal with the fallout. And then Sarah exploded. I'd seen her angry before, But this was something different. It was like she had lost control of herself completely. She screamed at me, accusing me of betraying her, of being the reason our marriage was falling apart. I couldn't help but laugh, though it was a bitter, humorless laugh. Here she was, yelling at me as if she hadn't just been out with Bob, booking hotel rooms and playing the perfect little mistress. I let her scream for a bit, just watching her unravel. She was pacing back and forth, throwing her hands up, cursing me, calling me every name in the book. And I just stood there, waiting for her to run out of steam. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I pulled out my phone and showed her the photo, the one of her and Bob, mid-kiss in the restaurant. The one she thought no one would ever see. "I know about the hotel," I said calmly, holding the phone up to her face so she could see the proof. "The one you rented for tonight. The one you thought you'd be spending the night in with Bob." Her expression changed instantly. Gone was the anger, the righteous indignation. It was replaced by shock, maybe even a little fear. She stammered something, tried to explain herself, but I wasn't interested in her excuses. "You're staying there tonight," I said, my voice cold. "That room isn't going to waste." For a second, she didn't say anything. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out how to salvage this, how to turn it around and make herself the victim. But she couldn't. Not this time. She was caught, and she knew it. She tried to fight back, to throw more blame my way. How could you do this?" she screamed, her voice trembling. "After everything we've been through, you're the one who's cheating now? How can you live with yourself?" I just shook my head. "You think I'm the one who's to blame here?" I asked, incredulous. "You went out with another man. You rented a hotel room with plans to sleep with him. Don't stand there and act like you're innocent in all this." She kept trying to argue, to make it seem like what I had done was worse than what she had been doing for God knows how long. But I wasn't playing her game anymore. I stood my ground, kept my voice level, and told her how it was. I told her that this was her fault, that everything that had happened, from her emotional distance to her affair with Bob, had led us to this exact moment. Eventually, she gave up. She grabbed her purse, fumbled for her phone, and called a taxi. I didn't stop her. I just watched her pack up her things, knowing she was going to that hotel room she had rented for Bob. Only now, she'd be spending the night there alone. When the door finally slammed shut behind her, I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief. Just a cold, empty space where our life together used to be. Sure, the revenge was satisfying in a way, but it didn't fill the void she had left in our marriage. It didn't fix anything. All it did was bring everything to its inevitable end. But this wasn't the end of the story. Not yet. The next part of my plan? That was already in motion. And when it was done, Sarah wouldn't just be humiliated. She'd be destroyed. Filing for divorce was the final nail in the coffin. After everything that had happened, the lies, the cheating, the betrayal, it was the only logical step. I wasn't interested in trying to salvage anything anymore. I wasn't interested in her excuses, her tears, or her attempts to rewrite history. As far as I was concerned, our marriage had ended the moment she stepped out with Bob. The rest was just formalities. I didn't waste any time. I hired the best lawyers money could buy. No half measures, no cutting corners. These guys were sharks, the kind of attorneys who didn't just win cases. They annihilated the opposition. I knew I was in good hands. We sat down, went over everything, and I laid out exactly what I wanted. I wanted her out of my life for good, and I wanted to make sure she walked away with as little as possible. This wasn't about being fair. This was about making sure she paid the price for everything she had done. And trust me, I had the resources to make sure that happened. The first thing I did was block her on my phone. I didn't want to hear from her, didn't want to read her texts, didn't want to listen to her voicemails. Every possible method of communication blocked. If she needed to reach me, she'd have to do it through the lawyers. There was nothing left to say anyway. The moment she left for that hotel, any last shred of care or concern I had for her vanished. We were done. The divorce process, as expected, took time. A lot of time. These things never go quickly, especially when there's money involved. And we had a lot of it to fight over. The house, the assets, the business, it was all on the table. Sarah tried to play hardball at first. She thought she was entitled to half of everything, thought she could walk away from our marriage with a clean slate and a fat bank account. But she underestimated me. She underestimated what I was willing to do to make sure she got what she deserved, and only what she deserved. We had court dates, meetings with lawyers, depositions, the whole ugly process. And you know what? Not once did we talk. Every time we saw each other in the courtroom, we didn't say a word. We barely even looked at each other. I'd glance over and see her sitting there, trying to look composed, but I could tell she was cracking. She was unraveling under the pressure. This wasn't the Sarah I had married. This was a woman desperately trying to hold on to whatever she could, but she was slipping, and she knew it. My lawyers were relentless. They tore her apart in every negotiation, every hearing. They found every loophole, every clause in our prenup, every bit of financial evidence that worked in my favor. And, of course, the photos of her with Bob, those were the final blow. The evidence of her infidelity was ironclad. She couldn't deny it. She couldn't spin it. She was caught. And the court saw it for what it was, her fault. Her affair. Her destruction of our marriage. The process dragged on for months. At times, it felt like it would never end. But I was patient. I wasn't in a rush. Every day that passed, I knew we were getting closer to the end, and I knew I was winning. I could see it in her face, the way she carried herself, defeated, humiliated. She had gone from trying to fight me tooth and nail to barely showing up to the hearings. I think, deep down, she knew there was no way out for her. Not this time. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, the day came when it was all over. The judge handed down the final ruling, and it was exactly what I had hoped for. I walked away with nearly everything: the house, the business, the majority of our assets. Sarah? She was left with scraps. A small, meager settlement that wouldn't last her more than a few months. She tried to argue for more, tried to claim that she needed support, but the evidence was against her. The court sided with me on every major point. It was over. I'll never forget the look on her face when the final ruling was read. It was a mix of disbelief, anger, and something else. Maybe regret? I don't know. I didn't care. All I knew was that I had won. I had taken everything from her, just like she had tried to take everything from me. And she was left with almost nothing. As we left the courtroom that last day, I didn't say a word to her. There was nothing left to say. We were done, finally, completely done. I didn't look back as I walked out the door, and I haven't looked back since. But the truth is, even with all of this behind me, there's no real satisfaction. Sure, I took almost everything from her. Sure, she's out of my life. But there's no victory in this. No feeling of triumph. What's left is just the empty aftermath of a marriage that should have ended long before it did. I won the battle, but the war? The war was hell, and nobody really comes out of that unscathed. It's strange, to be on the other side of all that chaos. To look back at everything, the lies, the betrayal, the divorce, and realize it's finally over. For a long time, it felt like I'd never get to this point, like the mess Sarah had created would follow me forever. But here I am, standing, living, moving forward. The first few months after the divorce were rough. Not gonna lie, I thought that once everything was settled, I'd feel some kind of relief. I thought maybe winning, taking everything from her, would make me feel whole again. But the truth is, nothing really prepares you for the aftermath. You can't just switch off the years of history, the emotional scars, and the weight of it all. There's no magic moment where everything goes back to normal. You have to rebuild. And rebuilding? That takes time. I had to relearn who I was outside of my marriage, outside of the anger and revenge. For so long, everything had been about her, about catching her, exposing her, and getting back at her. Once that was over, I had to figure out what was left of me. I threw myself into my work, expanded my business even further. I poured all my focus into it, and it paid off. The company is thriving, better than ever, and financially, I'm in a great place. Money never solves all your problems, but I'll be honest, it makes things a hell of a lot easier when you're trying to rebuild your life. Therapy helped too. I didn't want to admit it at first, didn't want to sit in front of some stranger and spill my guts. But it worked. I learned how to let go of some of the anger, some of the bitterness. You carry that stuff around for too long, it'll eat you alive. It was a slow process, though. It wasn't like some overnight transformation. It was more like chipping away at a wall, bit by bit, until eventually you can see what's on the other side. I started taking better care of myself too, physically and mentally. I got back into working out, eating better, and making time for the things I enjoy. I found hobbies I'd forgotten about, things that had nothing to do with Sarah or our marriage. It helped me create a life that felt like mine again, not just something left in the wreckage of what we had. But relationships? That's a different story. I'm not looking for anything. I've learned that some things in life just aren't for me, and relationships might be one of those things. I don't trust the idea of love anymore, not in the way I used to. After everything I've been through, it's hard to imagine letting anyone get that close again, giving someone that kind of power over me. I know people say you should never let one bad experience define you. But this wasn't just one bad experience. This was my whole world, and it collapsed. And honestly, I'm okay with it. I'm okay with being on my own. Some people think you need someone else to complete you, to make life meaningful, but I've learned that's bullshit. You can be whole on your own. You can find peace, happiness, and satisfaction without needing someone else by your side. I don't need a relationship to feel like my life has purpose. These days, my focus is on me, my work, my health, my future. I travel when I want to, I spend time with friends, I live my life without any drama or bullshit weighing me down. It's simple, it's quiet, and it's exactly what I need. Will I ever change my mind? Maybe. Who knows what the future holds? But for now, I'm done with love, with relationships, with putting my heart on the line for someone else. I've learned that sometimes the only person you can really count on is yourself. And that's enough for me. So yeah, I'm doing well. Better than I have in years. And if that means staying single, staying focused on myself, then so be it. I've earned this peace, and I'm not about to give it up for anyone. Not anymore.